This is Barbara London calling. Welcome once again to my podcast series about the wild world of media art. I'm calling media artists from around the world, many of whom I've worked with as an author and curator. Together, we're exploring what motivates and what inspires these artists, and how they see the world as media artists working at the forefront of technology and creativity. Today, I'm calling Samson Young, a Hong Kong-based artist who I consider to be one of today's most talented investigators of sound as art. Samson works in a broad range of disciplines: music composition, performance, installation, sound, video, drawing, and design. His artwork is elegant yet razor sharp, and sometimes political in nature, as he addresses the vicissitudes of language and history. Samson, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Barbara, for having me.
So let's begin. So you received a PhD in music composition from Princeton, a master's of philosophy in music composition from the University of Hong Kong, and a BA in music philosophy and gender studies from the University of Sydney. So I'm curious, how did growing up in Hong Kong shape your outlook on life? And how did you feel that outlook change once you came to the US?
Yeah, I grew up in Hong Kong, and I think my experience of growing up in Hong Kong is probably not so dissimilar to the experience of growing up in another large, condensed urban area. We consumed a lot of popular culture coming from the US and UK, but also, of course, in Japan. But Hong Kong also has, at one point in time, when I was growing up, it also had a very strong popular culture. A lot of films were made in Hong Kong. So all of those things, I guess I still carry with me. The popular culture industry here is not as strong anymore. I think those sort of early years of being immersed in Hong Kong pop culture still left a mark in me. And then I grew up in Sydney, Australia. I spent my teenage years there, and I did my undergrad there, as you had mentioned. When I was living there, it was a particularly conservative time. There was a little bit of especially Asian immigrant sort of sentiment. Pauline Hanson, conservative politician who was running on an anti-immigrant platform, was gaining popularity. So I think in some way that experience shaped me as well. And of course, then US is a whole different thing. But I mostly spent my time in New York. As soon as I was able to, I moved out of New Jersey, moved out of the college town and lived in New York. So in many ways, that was much more like being in Hong Kong in terms of the mix of people or the density of the city. But of course, in terms of the offering in culture, there's no comparison. There's a lot more happening in New York.
Let's move on to a series of works that you've done which involve muting as a technique and concept. And perhaps we can zone in on the one work, your video sound installation, Muted Lion's Dance, which can be seen as a reimagining and a reconstruction of the auditory. So as I understand it, it's a single-channel video projection and traditional Chinese performance, dance and costume, without the usual percussive sounds of the drums playing with them. So I'm fascinated by how it is that the sounds of the performers' own physical exertion, their feet hitting the ground, their deep inhales and exhales, and the rustling of their clothes comes to the forefront. So could you tell me a little more about this idea of muting? And I know you've said muting is not the same as doing nothing.
Yeah, so maybe a good place to start would be to go back to how that whole series was originally conceived. So the Muted Line Dance actually belongs to a series of works titled Muted Situations. And so initially, these muted situations, they exist as text instruction scores. So they're just text describing a situation to be realized. And then over the years, I have realized some of these text-based performances and made them into either live performances, recordings, or videos, or a combination of these things. And so right now there are 22 of them. And the Muted Line Dance is one of the early ones, actually. And so I first made this series of work in response to a prompt given to me by a curator. I was, for 1 year of the Manchester Asia Triennial, I was given the space, a space inside of a library, as the venue for making a sound installation. It's inside of this historic building, this pretty old library, but at a quieter wing of the library. And so that paradox interested me, like thinking about how you would make a sound piece that could live inside of a library and what sort of environment that really is for a sound installation, what sort of context that really is. But if you start to think about what the library is in terms of the sound that you hear, it's not really an entirely silent environment. What you get is very specific layers of sounds that are suppressed, usually the speaking voice. So you're trying to whisper and you're trying to keep conversation at a low level. And certainly speaking on the phone is not something that is permitted. So that layer certainly is suppressed. But then the staffs at the library or the people who are reshelving the books and pushing carts around, these are certainly sounds that you can make. And if you are, say, opening and closing your backpack and taking books in and out of the bag, that certainly is allowed. And people make sound doing those things. And there are announcements coming from the public announcement system. So there are other layers of sound that are still there and they are in some way permitted. So it got me thinking about how there are different parallel time, I guess, happening. And I was trying to imagine a situation where you can switch on and off some of these times, these layers of sound at will. So that thinking was what the original impulse of the muted situation is. And so in each of these situations, there is a very specific layer of sound that is intended to be muted. So with the Muted Line Dance, it's the percussion noises and sound that is to be taken out. But then, of course, there are other sounds that are not only allowed to emerge because you've taken out the loudest thing, but actually there's an active investment in reinvesting in those other layers of sound so they don't diminish for as much as possible, only because you've muted one layer of sound. So with the line dance, for example, it's actually really quite difficult for the dancers to dance without the percussion music because that's kind of what they get their bearing from. But because it's very important in the spirit of the Muted Situation series that these performances are, for as far as possible, still performed with the same level of energy and same performative intent. So then we have to almost reverse engineer it and sort of figure out a way for dancers to be able to dance with confidence. So they had an earpiece in their ear, and the coach of the line dancing team was actually counting in their head. So although they were not listening to the percussion music, they were still getting the rhythm and sort of getting coordinated that way. So that's specifically the muted line dance, but then it works in the same spirit for the other muted situations as well. A muted boxing match or muted string quartet. And most recently we had the muted orchestra number 22, which is the last one in the series. So the series finished with number 22, and I'm not going to make any more of those.
So I know from the muted lion dance, you're very, very, very particular in the installation with the speakers, because that's what a visitor to an exhibition who sees the work, they're viewing the dance, but as you have described, the sound is so important, but you very carefully, architecturally place the speakers. Do you want to talk about that?
I mean, when I make sound pieces or video pieces that has an important sound component, which is for me most often the case, I try to be specific with the speakers. I think when you are mixing, say, music with more layers for different speakers, there's a little more room for, let's say, discrepancy between different kinds of speakers. I mean, of course, the quality of sound between different speakers are always going to be different. But when you have a musical composition with many layers of sound, there is more information for the ear to hold on to, even if the content of the sound or maybe the EQ balance of the sound shifts between different speakers. But with a piece like the muted line dance, for example, so much of it is noise and noise without sort of let's say a melodic content. So there is much less information there. But actually because of that, and because you're only really hearing, for example, these like stomping of the feet on the desk and the rattling of the lion's head between speakers, because that's what you're focusing on, they can really sound quite different. So by specifying sort of models of speakers, I just know that they're going to sound more like the way I mix them. So I think it's not a minor thing, actually, but there is a simple solution to it, which is to be specific with speaker. And the other thing is actually volume level. So, of course, it really depends on the space too. You have to make adjustment according to the space. But knowing what kind of speakers you're going to be using and being used to the dynamic range of those speakers also makes a big difference.
So this is a very good time to then move on to a fantastic work I saw of yours at the Guggenheim, the multi-part installation called Possible Music #1, and that was part of the One Hand Clapping show. I walked into this gallery at the Guggenheim and you just so totally transformed it with cobalt blue carpet, aqua-colored walls, various shapes that you had as well. These unusual, I think they were pentagonal speakers, each with a very stocky artificial flower poking out. And the speakers, I believe, played the soundtrack for your video that you made, emulating the sounds of imagined horn instruments. So this was an incredible work to me. And I actually went back over 4 times. Just, you had such complexity. I'm curious, there are many questions here. For the brass instruments, you made them and the sound with an algorithm. How did you do that?
Yeah, so the software that I used to generate those brass sound, it's a physical modeling software. So physical modeling is a technique in computer sound synthesis, which in a nutshell is a way to simulate the sound of an acoustic instrument by describing the physical properties of that instrument. So for example, if you're trying to make the sound of a trumpet, which is what I did, you would give the software description of the instrument's dimension. You would tell what material the trumpet is made of. You would also say fine details which actually affect the sound, which you can also punch into the model, things like the temperature of the breath. So I was using this NESS software, NESS, which was developed by the NESS team at the University of Edinburgh. Stephen Bilbao is the principal investigator of the research team. So I took a residency at the University of Edinburgh through the Talbot Rice Gallery. And I got to know this team of researcher, and they actually lived somewhere between the physics department and the music department, actually. And my initial meeting with Stephen was actually in the physics department. And so at that point, I was still exploring sort of different people within the university that I might be interested in collaborating with. But as soon as I met the Nest Group, I knew I wanted to work with them. And so their software is not a commercial software. It's not made to be easy to use. Actually, it's very sort of code-based. So the Nest team taught me how to use the software. And as soon as I got my head around the software, I started, quote unquote, abusing it. So I started doing things that you are not, quote unquote, supposed to do. So for example, one of the parameters in the synthesis is the breath, the temperature of the breath, which usually for their application stays at a constant level. But of course, I started tweaking it so you would get theoretically fire dragon breath or ice dragon breath, and sort of trying to see what that would sound like. And I also started making really, really big trumpets, really long trumpets that really couldn't exist in the real world. And I had a lot of fun with it, but I also, both me and Stefan Bilbao from the group realized that these are sounds that the research group don't usually they don't really go into that sort of territory. And B is also the kind of sound that are not easy to make with other synthesis technique. And I'm always very interested in this when I'm making things with a tool such as the Nest software. I'm interested in exploring corners of that field to make things that are otherwise maybe difficult or awkward through other ways. With that software, I generated a bunch of instruments that are impossible to exist in the real world. I generated some very short compositions with these unusual instruments, and I mixed them with samples and recordings of bugle call. So I imagined them to be sort of this collection of monstrous, weird miniature bugle calls that you would hear throughout the day. Let's say if you're in the army, and like these signal calls that you hear throughout the day, basically that punctuate your day.
I've been very fortunate because I've seen you in many cities of the world. It means I've seen lots of your work in these places. But this last August, you were briefly in Denmark, and I experienced a performance that you did called 3 Cases of Echoic Mimicry, or 3 Attempts at Hearing Outside My Own Effing Head, in which you use the concept from social psychology called echoic mimicry. And you were examining the genealogy of a song called Mo Li Hua, Jasmine Flower. So tell me more about this. I know, again, it's another very complicated work, which was performative, and also you performed alone with a video projection behind you. So it's very complex, but maybe you could dive into the ideas.
It's a bit of a mouthful to explain. I mean, I think my works are maybe increasingly getting that way. They are so dense with references that this is my perspective. Maybe the audience feels differently, or maybe when you view it, you see it differently. But when there's a certain level of density of information, then beyond a certain point, people actually they give up sort of trying to rationalize it, and so because they're so lost in it, then they actually soak in other things. So they are not so bogged down on trying to understand everything, and they begin to see the color, they begin to see the humor, they begin to let these things just sort of hit them in a more direct way. So that's been the inclination in the last couple of years. But specifically with this one piece, I was researching into the history of this very famous folk song, the Jasmine Flower song. So it's a Chinese folk song, but it's not any old Chinese folk song is one that is very connected to the national psyche. It's in a lot of sporting events or in New Year television show, you often would have performances of this song, and it's been covered by Kenny G and Celine Dion when they do their performance on CCTV, and that makes people very happy. It's a special song. So when I looked into the history of this song, though, the funny thing that I discovered was that the melody that we now know and associate with the song Jasmine Flower, if you look at the genealogy of that melody, that actually came from a transcription of the song, the first English embassy to China. There was this scholar and diplomat called John Barrow who was a part of that embassy, and he transcribed and published the melody in this book called Travel to China. And in that transcription, there's the melody, but there's also some lyrics that's been written down. Now, if you look at the lyrics of that song and compare those lyrics to how we know the song today, there are definitely a lot of inaccuracies. And also, if you compare and look at the melody in the John Barrow version with a couple of sources that have survived inside of China and in Japan, because, a lot of sources within China are lost. And we sometimes, when we look at sort of old music, especially, we need to look at sources that have survived in Japan. The version that has survived in Japan and inside of China are both more similar to each other than they are to the John Barrow version. So we can say with some level of certainty that the song itself has evolved, but somehow the version that we know, Jasmine Flower song today, actually came from this much older version that was transcribed by John Barrow. So that was the point of departure for the piece. Through that idea of sort of transcription culture being reflected back at you, I was, I guess, thinking about cultural appropriation and authenticity, but with actually a rather open attitude. I was, at the end, I guess what I was trying to say is that it's not really fruitful and productive to try to police these territories. And the result of all of that thinking was a 2-channel video where in the installation version, you would have one channel where you see a horse delivering a lecture on the history and the genealogy of the Jasmine Flower song. And then it moved on to talk about Kenny G, and it talked about later tank court music and how it survived in Japan. So that's one channel. And then in the other channel, there's a musical performance of an original composition where I was basically very forcefully trying to combine the melody and lyrics of the Monihua transcription, the quote-unquote inaccurate one from the John Barrow Travel from China book, and combine it with gagaku, Japanese gagaku melody, and perform an ensemble that included me on musical instruments that were created for touristic consumption, a horse, a harpsichord, and 2 singers.
Well, it was great, and I saw you perform as a horse. So
No, I perform as a horse in the lecture version. Yeah.
you had your head all covered. Yeah, it was great. In 2018, you were artist in residence at the University of Chicago, where you focused on research for a wonderful multimedia exhibition, Silver Moon or Golden Star, Which Will You Buy Me, at the Smart Museum. I gather it's loosely inspired by the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago. So what was it about that sense of idealism at the World's Fair that felt so relevant for you?
I think it was at a time when I was thinking about utopia a lot. So in that show, there were 3 music videos. And The one that directly references the Chicago World's Fair was actually the last one in that trilogy. In the other two videos, I was in the second video, for example, I was looking at Kang Youwei, this important figure in modern Chinese history. He's maybe the only somewhat utopian thinker in the modern history of China. The history of modern China is not exactly filled to the brim with utopian thinkers and utopian literature. I was actually focusing on not him himself, but somebody who worked for him in Canada. For the Emperor Restoration Association in Canada, the Canadian chapter of it at the turn of the century. This gentleman called Alexander Kam Yao, he was allegedly the first Canadian Chinese to be born in Canada. Very good in English, worked as a legal clerk, but he also penned a lot of the petition letters to the different head of state for the Emperor Restoration Association to try to convince the other head of state to restore the last emperor of China on his throne. Obviously, because he was good in English and he was very well educated. But the interesting thing about him is that he actually never traveled to China. So I was imagining that he had a somewhat romanticized image of the nation, I think, from his sort of perspective, and also in the context of the kind of racial discrimination that he would have faced. And so when I was making those three videos, I think I was thinking a lot about sort of utopia, how it felt, and how utopian thinking bypasses logic and rational thinking. Those three animations, I call them the Utopia trilogy, and they were all looking at those things. So when I started working on the trilogy, I already knew that I was going to work towards the Chicago World's Fair. So I just sort of, to think about utopia is such a big topic, I felt like I needed to work my way towards it. So I built this up both by repeating the form, but also by looking at this through different cultures and different times.
So then I was also fortunate. I was there for the opening, but I also was there to hear this remarkable performance that you worked with a high school girls choir. And it was truly extraordinary. So how did that come about? And did that have a utopian element too?
In the performance, we tried to perform and restage some of the music that was heard at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. And when I was digging through the archive of materials related to the fair at the university library, we found the score for the theme song of the fair itself, and also there was a theme that was written for the Sky Ride that was at the fair. So we performed those two songs, and we also performed a choral piece titled "The Dream Seller." It's a choral piece that I performed when I was young, and performing in a children's choir. And the song is basically a lullaby. It's very soothing. The music is very sort of peaceful. Very, there's nothing dissonant about the song. And it's talking about this dream seller that is trying to sell you a silver moon or a golden star, these beautiful dreams. But I remember specifically feeling like trying to picture what that dream seller looked like, and remembering the act of picturing what that dream seller looked like. I remember that feeling. And so that's actually where the title of the show came from, Silver Moon or Golden Star, which will you buy of me? In a nutshell, in these three music videos and also in this show, I wasn't trying to look at where sort of certain aspirational ideology come from geographically. I wasn't trying to sort of disassociate part of ideology and associate it with a very specific geographical location. But actually what I'm trying to think through, and this is actually something that is still a little... Like that show hasn't happened for long enough yet for me to be able to reflect fully upon it, I think. But I think what I'm trying to think about is if there are certain sort of ideological thinking, certain habits of aspiration, certain warm feelings towards one view of the world over the other, they have become so ingrained in me that I have devolved it to such an extent that I can't really say that this is not a part of me. They're all a part of me, and I can't really sort of separate part of myself and sort of pretend that certain parts are not me. I have fully digested them. But I also try to think both in images and in music. I was trying to think about how I feel about these things. So in the last animation, for example, there are these images that like many references to feelings about utopia, to some are more historical, but some are kind of quite absurd. For example, the miracle whip, which many people may be, I'm sure, would be disgusted by Miracle Whip. But for me, it's associated with a very specific memory. It's about this very sweet, tangy salad that my mom used to make that would be sitting in the fridge, and it's something that you could snack on when you come home. So it's about a certain feeling of warmth that you have, and it's not... Although, of course, it has the Miracle Whip. I mean, it came into the picture also because it first came into being at the Chicago World's Fair. It was promoted to the public as this sort of like replacement mayonnaise, because they also came up with the technology to make sort of Miracle Whip at that point. But regardless of the historical fact or where that thing came from, how it arrived in Hong Kong, how it was marketed in Hong Kong, I cannot disassociate that feeling of warmth towards Miracle Whip.
So last year, your project for Performa 19 was a collaboration, and you told me that it was the most complex work you've ever undertaken. Why was that?
Well, there was just so many moving parts, and having to choreograph for the cranes and not knowing fully how those things work until really the moment when I see them and see the musicians on them, and freaking out about the musicians just falling off those machines. And there's also just a lot of music. There was animation, there was lyrics, which I co-wrote with Eliza Lee, and there was costume. So I there was a lot of things going on, and I tried to be involved in all of those things. I made the costume myself, designed them, but I had some help fabricating them, but I designed them, and so there were just many elements. So that's why it's kind of complicated. So it was just a very nerve-wracking experience. I'm very glad that it happened, and it felt a little surreal still that we were able to pull it off. But I was very glad that I had that experience.
It's a complicated piece. You used construction cranes, and you had performers. Were people on the cranes? I was away when this happened.
We had 5 cherry picker cranes, and these machines, they had costumes on them, things that looked a little bit like the ballet tutus. And we had 4 electric guitar players and 1 singer. So the electric guitar players were members of the Ditter Electric Guitar Quartet from New York, who I've worked with in the past and was very happy to work with again. And then the singer was Michael Schneefel, who was a long time collaborator, and they were also dressed in costumes. And then we had one additional performer who is Eliza Lee, who helped me with the Cantonese lyrics. We had some parts that had Cantonese lyrics to them, but it was mostly in English. She helped me with those lyrics, but she was also a Cantonese opera singer, so she performed in the traditional Cantonese opera style in 2 of the scenes. The performers were on these machines, and the machines, they were moving up and down, getting closer to the audience and further away from the audience at different times. So there is a choreography to how these machines moved and crossed each other. There's the visual element, and they were sort of dancing, but there's actually also a sound element to the reason why they were moving around so much, and that was because the sound source was actually married to each of the player, meaning that the electric guitar player 1 and his sound was actually directly underneath him on the basket of the crane. So we didn't have like a one stereo feel. We basically had a multi-channel. We had a 5 speakers multi-channel system. Those speakers were mounted on the moving crane, and so by moving the cranes around, I was able to do some fun spatialization things with the piece. So at one point, I was sending Eliza's voice to these 5 speakers, and they were just sort of going around the room, which actually was the original thing that I was the most excited by, like having this multi-channel speaker system that could move away and closer to the audience as a part of the piece. So you can have the speaker that is really very, hovering right above you, and versus being 3-4 stories up from you and being quite far away.
So how do you work in the studio? Do you have a team? Are you there alone, composing, writing?
These days, I'm alone in my studio. I have one main assistant. These days, she's mostly helping me with looking after records and archive of photographs and helping me sometimes with things like text and research. But she's working from home these days because of COVID-19. And then I have, on the production side, I have another girl, Vivi. She sometimes comes in to help me when I am going through a particularly heavy production period. If I have to get things shipped and I need to pack things, or if I need to prep the surface of a 3D printed sculpture or something like this, she would come and help me. That's the team. But actually, most of the time, I'm on my own in the studio, and I keep to a routine. I go in pretty early in the morning. I'm a morning person, and then I actually try to leave on most days before 6. So I keep a pretty regular schedule.
So how have the last few months been for you, and what impact has COVID-19 had on the recent national unrest had on your practice?
Right now, in Hong Kong, we still have certain gathering restrictions in place, but those are due to be eased out soon. We've actually never had a lockdown per se. We have always been able to go out. You keep social distance, of course, and you try to and of course, everybody's wearing a mask when they are outside. During this time, I've mostly been sort of keeping to my own schedule and working on a couple of things that's been scheduled for the winter and the fall of this year. I got lucky in the sense that I had a bunch of production-heavy works that were truly out of the way before shit hit the fan. So I got all those things out of the way. And then in terms of my schedule this year, I had a little bit of a gap in the middle of the year before the new productions in the fall anyway. So I was able to keep to a rhythm. But of course, even things in the fall are getting canceled now. But I mean, that's the same for everybody, so it's not so special. Although I have to say, I think everything that is going on around me not only COVID-19, but of course, like you had mentioned, there was the social movement in Hong Kong last year, which is seeing some fresh energy because of the national security law proposal that's now on the table. All of those things have changed the way I think about things in ways that I can't yet articulate, but it's not a subtle way. So I was thinking to myself the other day, if me and Oriana, the curator from Smart Museum, if we were to have a discussion about making a show for Smart in 2 years into the future, the show would look very different. Not in a topical sense, not like not necessarily mean that I want to respond to the situation now. Even if I'm working on the same set of topic, this idea of utopia or any other topic, I feel like the show will come out looking very different. But it's something that I'm not yet able to articulate, I feel. But it's certainly something that is on my mind.
So here's my last question, my very last, I promise. So here's my last question that I ask everybody who's generous like you participating in this conversation series. So do you consider yourself a media artist?
I prefer the term multimedia artist because it means less. It's imprecise and it's so broad that it's almost meaningless. So I prefer it that way. I wouldn't call myself a media artist, I would say. But I would be more comfortable calling myself a multimedia artist, I think.
And not a sound artist?
Yeah, not a sound artist, a multimedia artist or an artist, like more generic. I mean, I do so many things that I feel like these labels are difficult.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your thinking. And you're a morning person. It's night there in Hong Kong. So thank you for breaking your pattern to be with me today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
On behalf of Samson Young, thanks for joining me for this episode of Barbara London Calling. Support for Barbara London Calling is generously provided by Bobby Clocher and Independent Curators International in conjunction with their upcoming exhibition, Seeing Sound, which I curated. Be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all the latest episodes. Follow us on Instagram at Barbara London Calling and check out barbaralondon.net for transcripts of each episode and links to the works discussed. Barbara London Calling is produced by Bauer Blue with lead producer Ryan Leahy and audio engineer Ammar Ibrahim. Special thanks to La Tigra for graciously providing our music. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.